Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode is about how remote work works, discussing the rigorous asynchronous systems, mindset, and methods that enable fully remote organizations to be successful, to support executives and managers updating work arrangements and implementing hybrid or fully remote work models. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can instead learn from the fully remote pioneers who launched their companies pre-pandemic, who have already wrestled through the biggest challenges and defined and refined viable solutions for their employees. We can benefit from their experiences, which taught them how to work effectively and efficiently when completely distributed. And, understanding the remote-first mindset, we can introduce and adapt essential methods for our own specific organization's distributed model to work seamlessly across different corporate and home offices and time zones. The foundation for long-term progress and growth, working across multiple locations in 2023, includes formalizing more asynchronous work processes to identify, log, map, and track all workflows and projects, tasks, and decisions for greater transparency, clarity, and competitive advantage over the on-premise focused companies, which continue to work in less documented, systematic, and measurable ways. I'm delighted to be talking to Liam Martin, a serial entrepreneur who co-founded and runs Timedoctor and Staff.com, a time tracking and productivity software platform. Liam is also a co-organizer of the world's largest remote work conference, Running Remote. He and his business partner, Rob Rawson, have co-authored a new book of the same name, which is focused on remote work methodology, emphasizing the asynchronous mindset. Hi, Liam. How are you?
I'm okay. My daughter is somewhat ill. She's listening to a lot of Coco Melon downstairs. So if she does come up during this podcast, I apologize. But it'll be an interesting kind of interruption, particularly since we're talking about remote work.
I totally accept any kind of interruption, especially like that, because that is the world that we live in, and the multidimensionality of it adds more depth and joy to it. Well, not always, but... So, Liam, I am very interested to talk about your new book and your experiences and how you approach things. First of all, I understand you were an ice dancer, and then it was the next steps that you took that started you on this journey.
So I can go all the way back to ice dancing. I was a competitive ice dancer and competed internationally. I was probably ranked about top 40 in the world at one point. And,
really? Congratulations.
Yeah,
wow. That's really serious stuff.
Yeah, I was competing. So at the age of 15, I was out of my parents' place and I was at international training centers throughout Canada. I'm Canadian. Wow. And so every year you go to a different international training center specifically for Worlds and Olympics. Mm-hmm. And at the age of 19, I was at the Canadian National Championships, which is the event that chooses who goes to the Olympics. So obviously a very important competition. And we were, I think we were 6th or 7th place going into the first event. So we finished our first event and we got 6th place. That was incredibly exciting because top 4 got to go on to Worlds and Olympics. So we were within striking distance of being able to get there. But my second event, I ended up breaking my kneecap at the very end of the competition. And about 30 seconds towards the end of the routine, and for anyone that hasn't watched, ice dancing before or pair skating. It's about a 3.5-minute routine, 4-minute routine. And you have to complete a whole bunch of different movements, lifts, and all that kind of stuff. And I had my partner up in my hands, and we tripped, and I fell on my kneecap, and it wouldn't have shattered had I not had an extra 130 pounds of weight in my hands. Oh. So when I hit the ice, my kneecap just completely shattered. And for anyone that's really hasn't done competitive sports before, the concept of the zone, when people talk about getting into the zone, really you get into this hyper realistic zone where you could almost speed up and slow down time. Like you can think 1,000 thoughts. When people talk about how their life flashed before their eyes,
right,
when they had a near-death experience, it's kind of like you're stuck in that, but for 4 minutes. And so I remember in those last 30 seconds, I got up, I finished the routine, and I started skating off towards the corner where you sit and you wait for your scores. And there were EMTs that were waiting at the corner of the rink. And I thought, why are there EMTs there? Because it hadn't even dawned on me that I was bleeding.
So you finished the last 30 seconds?
Yeah. So I think, again, for people that are doing competitive sports, you're locked in. So I came off the ice, and it was broken. So that was the end of my career. I had a real, not epiphany, but I had a real existential crisis where I thought to myself, well, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And it took me about 6 months.
And how old were you again?
I was 19.
19. Ooh,
19,
wow.
I think, close to 20.
And you hadn't thought about anything but ice dance until that point?
Well, I was competing, internationally, and it was, the goal was to be able to do this. And I was, at the age of 15, I was at different international training centers, so I wasn't living at home. We were tutored. The tutors honestly weren't that good. I didn't really get a really great education throughout high school.
So you've got a broken kneecap, and you have to try and work out what on earth you're going to do next.
Well, and no high school diploma. Yeah. So I have to figure out, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And one of the things that I tell people is that sports gave me hyper level of discipline. It just allowed me to be able to, when you're 15 and you have to skate 6 hours a day and do 3 hours of gym off ice workouts per day, if you're working 9 hours a day just being an athlete, that type of discipline is quite rare to develop. And so I got into university on a prayer, and I ended up taking an undergraduate degree, doing very well on that, going on to a master's, to a PhD at McGill University. I'm looking at my degree up on my wall right now. And about halfway through that, I realized that education really wasn't the goal for me. It was entrepreneurship. I was always very excited in entrepreneurship, and I had actually taken on a couple jobs that were very entrepreneurial before that point.
I understand that you did study sociology.
Sociology, yeah. Yeah, I think I learned two huge lessons from that. Number one was discipline, and I didn't really recognize how many other people were not as disciplined as I was. And that was a huge learning.
Most people.
And then the second one, it's so, and this feeds into entrepreneurship as well. Really, when you look at entrepreneurship, if you were to psychologically analyze that group of people, they have massive egos and they have massive amounts of discipline. So those two things combined, right? So they think, oh, no one's done this before. Well, I'm going to do it because I have the level of ego to be able to say that I'm going to do this. And then they have the discipline to be able to execute on that particular goal.
So you came out of McGill and you were far from anything to do with remote working at that point, right?
Yeah, well, I ended up teaching a class at McGill University. So I was a lecturer.
Oh, okay.
And my first ever class was horrible. I started with 300 students, and I ended up with less than 150 by the end of the semester.
Okay.
I remember walking into my supervisor's office and I said, I'm not very good at this. And he said, no, you are not. And I said, okay, so what do you think I should be doing next? And he said, you got to get pretty good at this thing if you want to continue on academically.
Right.
So either get better at this or figure out something else to do. 6 weeks later, I threw a master's thesis under his door and I was out into the real world. And that led me to my second business, but arguably a significantly more successful one, which was an online tutoring business. It was actually a non-online tutoring business. We're talking like more than 15 years back. And it was, I realized that I could tutor students through Skype and it would be significantly more cost effective for me because I didn't have to go from place to place to be able to tutor these students.
So it was simply a cost-effective solution. Okay.
Yeah, and the technology was available
Sure.
for us to actually be able to do it, which was the exciting part. So turned that into dozens of students throughout North America and Europe, and that went quite well.
You'd also got better at the tutoring aspect of it, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I think there's a difference between lecturing and tutoring.
Okay.
And so there's a big difference between being a teacher and a lecturer. I think the university system is actually quite broken. And that was another reason why I just didn't continue on with the PhD, to be able to do 20 years of research to be able to get the results of one study versus doing that in 6 months in the private sector.
Right.
It's just a completely different way of operating. So for me, I realized that that was not the model that I wanted to pursue. It gave me a really good framework of how to think effectively. And I don't regret taking that extra time. But sometimes I think about, well, if I had just been able to kind of realize who I was 7 years earlier, which was an entrepreneur, as opposed to me wanting to be an academic, how much further ahead would I be in life if I had just been able to kind of go back in time and realize that. I tell people that are coming right out of high school, that are really thinking about higher education, that are interested in entrepreneurship, I highly suggest that they go work for a tech company that has just closed their Series A that has less than 10 employees. Because you'll learn how to do everything inside of that organization because they don't have the headcount to be able to actually hire more people. But more importantly, the Series A allows you to be able to have the cash to run a $250,000 experiment or a $500,000 experiment and not get killed, versus working at KPMG where you're not going to be able to have that type of responsibility. So anyone that's in that type of headspace right now, you will learn way more working there for 2 years than you will spending 5 years, in an undergraduate degree.
So you had the online tutoring business, but you moved on. Why?
So I was also moonlighting for process documentation. I was running an agency that was actually providing people with how to basically systematize their organizations. And that was quite successful.
And that was because you had started to understand where your skills were more focused, or what you loved doing most was more on the process side of things than the teaching side of things.
The mechanics of running a business is really just bureaucracy, unfortunately. The reality of moving out of a company of one, if you get to 5 people, 10 people, really, to me, you can actually cheat your way up until the Dunbar number, which is about 100 to 150 people. And after that, people, unfortunately, cease to be names, however hard you try, and they start to become numbers. They start to actually feed into this bureaucratic system. Now, you want to be able to hold on to as much of the human element as you possibly can. And I think the success or failure of organizations is how much that they can hold on to that human element. But fundamentally, you need to actually just build out a system in order to be able to manage a business. And so I learned that lesson very early, particularly being forced into a remote business so early. Most remote businesses, which I like to call these remote pioneers that were remote before the pandemic, they were the ones that understood you need to build this systematization way earlier in a remote business. So if you're an on-premise business, maybe you need to be 100 people before you really build the processes that you would need inside of a remote business at 10 people. And I think a lot of people actually recognized that during the pandemic. So there was a huge shift where everyone, I call it remote at gunpoint. It really wasn't, it wasn't everyone's choice to be able to switch remotely, but everyone on planet Earth did. But one of the things that they lacked was the actual process documentation to be able to execute on it successfully.
Yes, I interviewed the CMO of Workfront, and she said that the people who are using their workflow management software were able to pivot very fast because they knew how everything worked. And if they were going to be doing it differently because people in different places, they could do that quickly. I look at the pandemic as being a wake-up call and a forced recognition of the benefits of flexible working, because so much telecommuting, teleworking was done before it. Mm-hmm. You then meet your business partner, Rob Rawson, and as a doctor, he'd had a very different experience in how and where he was remote working, much more internationally diverse. How did the idea for Timedoctor come to being based on such different experiences and backgrounds?
So with the tutoring business, one of the biggest problems that we had was that I would have a student that I would bill for 10 hours of work. And then the student would come back and say, I didn't work with my tutor for 10 hours. I worked with them for 5. And we'd go to the tutor and say, did you work with Jimmy for 5 hours or 10 hours? And he'd say, I billed you for 10. I worked with him for 10 hours. So we'd end up having to refund the student for the 5 hours, but pay the tutor the full 10 hours. And that actually gave us a significant loss in terms of our business. And so that was how Timedoctor really started. And then Rob also had the same issue where he had an organization before ours that was in 7 different countries. And the logistics of actually figuring out, okay, what are you working on? What am I working on? Was very, very difficult. And so we ended up working on that. And that company is still in operation and scaling at this point. We're in about 40. We have team members in 47 different countries all over the world. And that company is about 13 years old. And then off of that, we had also built this conference about 5 years ago called Running Remote, which was really me trying to solve for this other issue, which was, and again, it's like, you really have to think of, it's almost like BC and AD in terms of remote work. There was before COVID and then after COVID remote work epochs. But before COVID, there was no information on how to actually build remote companies past hiring a virtual assistant or maybe building a small agency.
Well, you mean that was fully remote? There was understanding and information about remote working or telecommuting?
Yes, there was definitely more of that information, but I would say in terms of building a company from day one that is completely remote, at that point in 2018, when we built the conference, we identified 7 companies with more than 1,000 people that were fully remote. 7.
Yeah.
So it was not those many companies. It was a very small group of people. There were companies like Basecamp. There was companies like WordPress, which is automatic WordPress. There were companies like GitLab, which have about 1,800 workers at this point. Those types of companies were what I like to call remote pioneers. Amir from Doist was another big company that had a lot of people all over planet Earth. So these companies, they operated their businesses completely differently from anyone else. And they had a different methodology with regards to how they built their businesses, which we talk about in my book, which I came out with, which I really... The big thing that everyone missed during the pandemic when everyone switched was, oh, well, remote work is exactly like regular work. You just do the same thing. And that is completely untrue. There was a methodology to it that these remote pioneers had figured out over the decades. And that's the point of the book, is to bring that system to hopefully the 99.5% of people that don't realize that there's a different way to be able to work remotely.
Predominantly, we're seeing that people want to work between 2.5 to 3 days in the office, depending on whether you're 20 to 29-year-olds or 50 to 64-year-olds. The way you approach process and designing work is so important for people trying to manage distributed teams, whether they are fully remote or hybrid. Some people are in the office, some people are not. And when I look towards the future, that's what I see as being the model for almost everybody. I think the fewest number of people are going to be in the office 100% of the time. More people will be fully remote than in the office 100% of the time. And then the bulk of people will be in the middle.
That is currently the way the data is going. So when you look at the breakdown, hybrid is by far the biggest kind of way of working in comparison to on-premise versus fully remote. I think there are unique challenges in that model that we're going to have to overcome. The biggest one is really what most of these remote work pioneers call distance bias. So
agreed.
As you get closer to a manager or a decision maker, you then therefore have better access to decision making. So
assuming that they're in the office.
Exactly. So the majority of these remote pioneers will actually purposefully not go into the office to therefore equalize the decision making. So to be able to give every single worker the same access to autonomous decision making as they possibly can, they need to be able to disconnect themselves from that system. And there's a really great reference, which is the Future Forum by Slack, which does a lot of data collection on this. And it's actually seeing this on not just the granular layer, but on a mass scale. Executives and high-level managers are leaving the organizations. They're going remote at a higher rate than other people because they have to actually disconnect themselves from that group.
What do you see in terms of taking some of the learnings from fully remote companies and designing systems and the mindset to bring to these new hybrid remote work inclusive models that are going to be effective going forward? I see this transition period as being very messy as people try and work it out. One of the things that you have talked about in your book is to do with the fact that as you have more understanding and more clarity about the work that goes on within your team or in your group or your company, the fewer managers you need. What are some of the other key factors that you see in this transition to really integrating remote working fully and on a hybrid basis in the most productive way?
So I think it really boils down to three core tenets when you think about how to deploy hybrid successfully. Asynchronous management is the methodology that has been the core piece that a lot of these remote pioneers have implemented. So asynchronous management is effectively the ability to be able to communicate without directly interacting with someone synchronously. So me and you are speaking synchronously right now, but the people that are listening to this recording are consuming this information asynchronously. I think a lot about classic television versus Netflix. If it was 8:30 at night and your favorite TV show was going to come on at 8:30, if you weren't butt in seat on the couch to be able to watch it at 8:30, you couldn't watch it for another 6 months until a rerun popped up. But with Netflix, it's an asynchronous model. All of that information is available to you to consume when it's most advantageous to you. Sure. And we basically take that same methodology as it applies to company information. So being able to have that information available to anyone allows for anyone to be able to basically manage themselves. And it comes to the first tenet, which is deliberate over-communication. So for me, that's allowing for people to have maximum data granularity in everything that they do. So can I measure actually what is my outcome variable that I'm really focused on? Is it the amount of views that I get on this podcast, as an example? Is that the metric that I'm being measured by? Can I actually share that with other people so that everyone has access to that same information? And also recognizing that there might be the graphics department I'm dependent upon the graphics department because if they don't make a really good thumbnail for this podcast, then maybe it doesn't get the click-through rate that it needs to be able to actually get the consumption that it's looking for and to go viral.
So if I understand this correctly, on a results basis, you're breaking it down into different pieces to understand what needs to be done live, the different pieces of the puzzle, who that relies on, and how they need to be completed?
Yeah, well, and also the dependencies. So when
project
you
management.
look at, it's fundamentally project management, but when you use that term,
right,
and this is, again, my bias because I've only worked in a remote environment. And when I started doing research for the book, I started interacting with on-premise organizations, what we call office environments. And it was so confusing to me, the lack of documentation. So there was massive amounts of decisions that were made, and there was no paper trail with regards to that information.
Or digital trail even.
Yeah, well, inside of remote organizations, there is a paper trail for everything, a digital paper trail, because you're forced to actually produce that. You can't operate the business without that. And so for me, it was just really confusing saying, well, okay, why did you guys decide to do this? Well, we don't really know. You don't know? What do you mean you didn't know? So if you were to tunnel into Timedoctor's business as an example, and I said, can you explain to me why we made this business decision 3 years ago? You could work as kind of like a company archaeologist, where you could go back 3 years, you could see the conversations, you could see the video calls if we're doing that synchronously. The majority of the stuff we do asynchronously. So we use a tool called Basecamp and another tool called Asana. Basecamp is where we have longer term conversations, let's say about a product feature, and you could see all the debates about why we chose to make this particular decision. And you might come to the conclusion, you'd say, well, Susan decided on this decision. And then we could say, well, we fired Susan 2.5 years ago. Why did we do that? Oh, because she had really bad ideas and she wasn't doing a good job. Well, maybe we should actually think about reversing this previous decision that we had.
Okay.
So all of that documentation is available. And that leads to the second big concept, which is what I call democratized workflows. So the ability to be able to have information available to everyone so that you have the same informational advantage as the CEO of the company, ideally. And that's very difficult for a lot of companies to be able to deal with, the leadership of those organizations. Because there's always, it's almost been the reverse perspective, which is, well, only give workers access to the information that they absolutely need to know. So inside of an autonomous meritocracy, really, you actually, to be able to empower everyone to make their best decisions and be as autonomous as humanly possible, they need as much information as they can consume, ideally. So the CEO of the company has all of this information in their heads, and that's usually the person that ends up making these very serious decisions. Well, when you give everyone else that same amount of information, magically the CEO doesn't become a genius anymore. Everyone else actually comes to the same conclusions. And if they don't come to the same conclusions, then you need to actually look at the decision being made, because quite possibly you made the wrong decision and you need to be able to analyze that.
I think this is the time for this to be happening because so much is changing. I think there's a lot more understanding by leaders. It's very hard for them to have all the understanding they need to be able to make a decision. There are many more inputs being gathered. But relinquishing as much control as you're talking about is definitely hard.
It's easily the most difficult part of this entire process. As I've done a lot of experimentation on this is the most difficult part. And then the third part is really detailed metrics. So having process documentation in place, being able to take all of that information, have a way to record it effectively, digitize it, and make it easily accessible to everyone in the organization is the third most difficult part of this spoken wheel system. And once you actually have that in place...
And why is that hard? Because people don't want to have the meetings recorded?
Yeah. There's a couple things that come to mind. So number one, when people look at process documentation, they see it as a mountain. It's like, how am I going to actually document all of this information? Okay. I suggest to people that they start with what I like to call an asynchronous week. So plan in the organization, you're going to not communicate synchronously for 1 week and then put together all the information that you need, not to become an asynchronous organization for the rest of your life, but to overcome 1 week of asynchronous communication. So that would mean maybe you build a certain level of documentation. Maybe you're going to be doing some onboarding one week and you need to be able to build some documentation on how to be able to onboard someone properly, or set up a CRM, or do something else connected to the operation of the business.
Sure.
But it's starting that process is overwhelming for people. And then also too, the upkeep, the maintenance of that process documentation is really difficult. Okay. So one of the things that we measure is the amount of time people query, interact with a particular process document. And we've found there's a couple companies that we ended up working with. One of them is called Trainual, which is a process documentation platform and tool. Okay. And they told me that the vast majority of process documents are, once they're built, they're never accessed again. Like, we're talking more than 95% of them. And so
wow, really?
The answers that people are looking for aren't actually queryable, meaning the information's in there. So I put all the information in a place. Right. But then if all the employees inside of the organization or team members can't have can't get access to that information, then you shouldn't have done it in the first place. And so this is a big problem.
What's the solution to that?
I think that there's a huge software opportunity.
So it's a question that the information wasn't documented in the way that people think about it or search for it?
So I think that, let's say this. If I was going to start another business, which I'm not going to because I don't have enough time, but if I was going to, I would build a process documentation tool that would be relatively simple. And I would connect it with some type of artificial intelligence like ChatGPT, which has been going nuts over the last month. And then that would be my user interface. I would ask questions. I would say, I need to sign my emails. How do I do that? And then it would just bring up the query for that actual process document, because it's the access to the information. It's how you query it, which is the real, I don't want to get too nerdy here in terms of like the actual overcoming all of these issues.
This is fascinating, yeah.
But this is really the big barrier that I see. And I brought 20 companies in to actually to bring them to an asynchronous model. Yep. And this was the number one reason why companies failed to become asynchronous, is the documentation was there. And after they went through all of these issues of actually putting up the documentation, they were still getting the same questions like, hey, Joanne, how do I sign my email? How do I set up a signature for my email? Or what's the protocol on doing that? Well, it's in the process documentation.
Even though the information had been written up, they just didn't.
Exactly. So GitLab, which is one of the other companies that we interviewed for the book, they have a interesting cultural perspective, which is always respond with a link. So when anyone asks them a question internally, they respond with a link to the process document. And it is really training someone culturally to be able to say, it's not bad to ask questions,
right?
But go to the database first, go to the FAQ, go to the process documentation before you interrupt someone's flow state with a question.
Got it. Okay.
So it's really moving towards the model of the system being the manager, not the individual. The individual deals with the EQ side of management, meaning the vast majority of one-on-one meetings that I have with people is, how are you doing? What direction are you going in your life? How can I better help you navigate that? Because the goals are already identified. We know what the goals are because we've both the manager and the worker have both come to a conclusion that that's the target that we need to reach.
Right.
We know what that is on a daily or weekly cadence. I usually don't like monthly cadences. So there's some type of quantifiable longitudinal goal that every single worker has at least one of. And we measure that. We instrument against it weekly.
Is a month too long for most people?
A month is too long because sometimes we break it down by quarters. And so we'll have quarterly goals. We have yearly goals and quarterly goals.
Okay.
And if it's a monthly instrumentation, well, you've only got 3 kicks at the can before you're in deep trouble. You need to be able to make course corrections earlier than that.
Okay.
So
Okay,
if
that
I'm
makes sense.
identifying, let's say I want to add an extra 100,000 clicks to my views to my YouTube channel, and by month 1, I've added 10,000, well, I'm already in deep trouble. I need to be able to make a course correction very quickly.
Sure.
So yeah, that's why we instrument it weekly. The most I would tell people is biweekly, to be honest with you, but not monthly. And so we bring in all of that data. And also, if at all possible, you want that automated. So the actual worker is not responsible for putting in that information. It's built into the system. So this gives you 2 advantages. Number 1, the worker can't give their version of success, right? It's a third-party source of information that we've both agreed is a indelible source of information.
Yep. Okay.
For everyone. And then number 2, it actually removes them putting it in manually, which again allows them more time to actually focus on work as opposed to, this all kind of focuses on a core thesis, which was my friend Cal wrote a book called Deep Work.
Oh, yes. No, I've read it. Yeah.
And this is basically, I would call running remote I would call it deep work for organizations, which is what is the methodology that you need to be able to implement to maximize autonomy for every single team member inside of the organization, so they don't have to talk to anyone if they don't want to, right? And I'm not against people. A lot of people have, said that the book sounds like like we're the board or something like that no one wants to talk to each other. We love to talk to each other. We don't have to talk to each other to be able to get the answers that we're looking for in terms of accomplishing the work. In terms of actually hanging out with people and, having fun and all that kind of stuff, we talk all the time. But we don't talk about work stuff anywhere near to the same degree as an on-premise organization that is synchronous. Because that lazy form of communication, I would define it as a lazy form of communication, which lacks documentation, produces an environment where 10 years down the road, you've got all of these people that are kind of doing things, but you have no idea what the heck they're doing or what goal they're serving.
There can be more human interaction without there being a lower fidelity in terms of completion of goals or tasks. I don't correlate that those type of interactions are going to naturally result in worse outcomes. Most companies are likely to be working for at least many years to come with hybrid models. Trying to get them off live interaction is going to be harder. What are you imagining is likely to be an effective and productive way of working? How much asynchronous is going to be possible to really push people towards in the next few years?
Sure. So I can give you some quantifiable touch points. Most of the asynchronous organizations that I interact with for the book and en masse really target about 10% of their work hours being committed towards synchronous communication, meaning a Zoom call, one-on-ones, whatever it might be.
And these are mostly fully remote?
Yeah, these are almost entirely remote-first organizations.
All right.
So they're looking at 10% of their day being synchronous, meaning mostly jumping on Zoom or Google Meet calls, and then the rest of that time being focused on deep work as much as humanly possible. When I have asked people this question, and with Timedoctor, I actually have a lot of this data because we're able to collect a lot of the metadata connected from just people working remotely, anonymously, obviously. The breakdown of remote and hybrid organizations is probably around 40 to 50% of their workday is spent on Zoom. And I would say that that is too high for an effective organization. And I really kind of think about this almost as it's a different working model, and it's just it's like a free market type of system, right? If I have a $300,000 engineer, as an example, and they have to sit for 30 to 40% of their workday learning about other things inside of the company as opposed to writing code, versus them sitting for 10% of their day doing it. En masse, if you're talking about 1,000 engineers, they build more effective code. And as long as they're able to collaborate asynchronously, meaning communicating effectively through the project management systems in order to be able to actually collaborate properly and build that code, you're going to have a better organization over the long term. I think and I was in another podcast and I really kind of thought this through, hasn't really been completed yet in terms of my thinking about it. But if you took 1,000 companies, 500 of them were synchronous and 500 of them are asynchronous. I think from seat 1 to 10, from 1 to 10 employees, the synchronous organization is probably going to overtake the asynchronous organization. The speed of communication is going to be faster. It's going to be messier. There's not going to be documentation in there, but the ability to be able to collaborate more effectively if everyone is in the same space is going to be more effective. So if you're a tech startup, as an example, it's probably really advantageous for you because the quality of your ideas is really going to denote whether or not you're going to succeed or fail. But then the second stage is the execution on that idea. And I think to scale organizations, asynchronous communication is probably, it's a much more effective model than synchronous management, because you don't just have to train one salesperson, as an example, because maybe the VP of sales, you only have one VP of sales and they actually have to sit down and train that person for 2 to 3 weeks before they can actually on-ramp them and they're a successful salesperson. You could build process documentation that could train 100 at the same time if you really wanted to. And then those employees could ask questions to that salesperson when needed, so that manager can scale much more.
Right.
The quality of the ideas, that initial launch would be faster. The scale stage would be more effective with asynchronous. And since really tech startups, even though everyone wants to think that they're geniuses, and my world is really only kind of connected to the tech startup world, so I can't speak outside of that realm. But when you think about, and actually when you think about the most popular remote work job in the world, which is customer support reps, that's 13% of all remote workers is customer support reps. At the end of the day, you can write down everything that person needs in order to be successful in their position, including the training, the actual support that they would need, the management. And so training that synchronously versus asynchronously, it's really going to be like, as Darren Murph, the head of remote at GitLab, has stated in the book, it's going to be a horse and buggy versus a Model T moment, where you're just going to be able to actually, because we've been empowered through technology to be able to deploy this information at scale, you can disseminate that information at scale. You can provide a much faster ability to scale an organization than you could in the past. And we're starting to see this quite a bit inside of remote first organizations.
I just want to try and clarify, because you talk about synchronous or asynchronous. And for me, almost every company is in between. Particularly now that we are working in a distributed fashion, the need for optimizing how we're working means that asynchronous becomes much more important. I'm trying not to say we're either this or that.
It's a grayscale, right? So when I talk about asynchronous organizations being 10% synchronous, those are people that I'd really put in the async camp, versus 50% synchronous. I would really put them in the, okay, well, I'm doing stuff. There's work that I'm doing, and then I'm doing a lot of meetings. The purpose of the book for me was to actually move people from 50% to 40%, as an example, like shave off a couple of those redundant meetings that you don't necessarily need to be able to, do. I'll give you a perfect example is Shopify last week. They, when they started the new year, they deleted all recurring meetings.
Oh, I know. I saw that. Yes.
And so they're really taking asynchronous to heart. They're saying, let's actually just do a complete reset of the organization, and let's actually figure out which meetings are important. Because, and the other thing that's interesting that they're doing is they're forcing everyone to not reset those recurring meetings for 2 weeks. So they're just seeing did we really need to meet or do we not really need to meet? That's a perfect example of what I would love to be able to see a lot more companies doing. So when you think about, again, it's not a async or sync. It is, could I get an hour more back per week? Or sorry, even an hour back per day, I think is totally reasonable in terms of, I was sitting in a meeting yesterday, and one of our rules is that if a meeting isn't valuable, you walk out of it. You don't have to actually tell anyone. You just can.
Oh, that's an Elon Musk thing, yeah.
Yeah, it works because you have a live audience, right? And if all of a sudden you start with 12 people and you end up with 4, it's like, oh, okay, maybe we shouldn't have done this in the first place.
There's a not having effective meetings, and then there's an asynchronous piece of it. So there's, did I invite too many people? We still needed to have a meeting. It could have been a lot shorter. It could have been fewer people. And the people who didn't need to be there, they could have actually absorbed or followed or reviewed the meeting and contributed asynchronously. But there might have still needed to be a short meeting with 2 people or 3 people rather than 7. I was lazy and people had FOMO and wanted to be included. There are lots of different elements there. I think the core for me, which I so love about what you're talking about, is really thinking about how we can design work effectively. About going to 10% or not, I think few companies are going to go all that way, but I really love what you're doing and the journey that we're on, trying to understand more about how we can communicating differently with all these amazing tools that we have. 2 last things. What haven't I asked you that I should have done? And then the last thing is a company or a team that wants to be using asynchronous work more effectively tomorrow. What can they do?
So what question I always love to get asked, and this is a recurring one, but I really like it, is where are we going post-COVID? Because I really think we're at an epoch now where it was BC and then, after COVID, it's going to be absolutely monumental. Does this actually become a business model that, a good minority of the world pursues permanently? Or is this something that is a blip in our history where it's, during COVID, we all worked from home, but that was kind of a laugh and we went back to the office. I honestly don't know which one it's going to be. I can tell you which one I'm biased towards, but I don't want to BS people and say, oh, everyone is absolutely never going to go back to the office ever again. No, there's a lot of positive forces towards the office, and there's also a lot of people. The biggest form of real estate in the world is corporate real estate. It's like 14% of the US economy. It's a huge chunk. And right now, that is a ticking time bomb where people are just brand new Salesforce offices that have 1.1 million square feet. They're currently using 1 million square feet, and they projected to be using all of it by this point. So that's going to be very interesting, and I'm very interested in figuring out what's going to be happening next. When you think about the methodology of remote work, I'm going to be pretty biased on this one, but the book is really important on that one, Running Remote, in terms of actually putting that together and giving that a read. The audiobook is a very easy, I think it's like 3.5 hours.
So read the book and...
So read the book. I would also probably say come to the conference, the Running Remote conference, which is where you can get very much, if you like the book, the conference is all of that. And again, my daughter is sitting right behind me. She's listening to Coco Melon. It's all good.
So I love that.
I appreciate everyone that's listening, realizing that real world is happening.
You can't see her, but she's really cute.
Yeah, she's a cute little redhead. And then I would probably say the next thing, so I ran some experiments trying to get people to switch over to an asynchronous model, and it did not succeed. Mm-hmm. And I would have to boil it down
fully
to
asynchronous.
Fully asynchronous, meaning less than 10% of their day is spent doing meetings and 90% of their day is doing work, right? So the more that you can optimize a work day for work versus meeting and doing things around work, the more successful that organization shall be, or at least that's my personal thesis and the thesis of asynchronous management. So the number one reason why it failed was lack of consumption of documentation, meaning it was easy to actually get people to document things, but then people wouldn't actually go out and find that information. The second most important, which was a close second, was that the actual executives of the organization, the leadership of the organization, did not believe in it. So there was a major division between some team members and managers saying, I'm going to really pursue an asynchronous model. I'm going to respond with a link, as an example, when one of my direct reports wants to ask a question.
Right.
I won't just explain it to them or jump onto a Zoom call. And then the other part that was really problematic in terms of that management, they would force synchronous communication upon team members that didn't actually want to be able to be synchronous. So they would say, hey, let's just jump onto a quick call to be able to address this. And that was something that ended up slowing down the organization overall. And again, putting it over that 10% that we had really set as a target. So, tools are obviously quite useful if you want to get super granular. You need a project management system. You need something like Asana that we personally use. You can use something else, but we love that. You need a way to be able to document information. Trainual is a great tool to be able to do that. You need a way to be able to actually record that information. We had mentioned Loom. Loom's a great tool to be able to execute on that.
You use Loom for recording meetings?
No, we usually use Zoom for recording meetings, but then we actually have a really cool tool that ends up collecting all of that information and the metrics on it. So it dictates the entire meeting, and it also tells you who communicates at what rate. So maybe in a meeting of 8 people, I spoke 65% of the time, and it actually can provide you a pop-up saying, you're talking too much. Like,
right. Yes.
Or if you're not talking at all, why are you here? You should leave.
Who do you use? The Ref Analytics does that. Headroom does that. I think that really helps meetings be more.
I can't remember what the name of the tool is, but we can definitely put it in the show notes and I can email it to you after the fact.
Yes, please do.
And so we've gone through 2 or 3 iterations of that. And then what this tool also does is it dictates everything, and then it provides the optimal minutes of what decisions did we make as an organization.
Oh, wow. Yes, definitely. Let me know that. That's fantastic.
Another tool that we use is Fellow. And what Fellow does is it allows me to be able to asynchronously analyze one-on-ones, particularly. You can use it for all meetings, but what it allows me to be able to do is create specific buckets. So if I were to have a one-on-one with you, I would drop in, I need to talk about this, or I need to talk about that. But then you can actually come in and communicate with me asynchronously and clear those tickets. And it actually encourages you to clear all of those issues.
Prior to the meeting?
Prior to the meeting, because the goal of the tool is to not have the meeting. It's a great tool for that. And it really can help reduce the amount. Let's say that you... The rule that we have is if there's less than 3 issues in a Fellow, we don't have the meeting, and the actual Google Calendar invite is automatically deleted so that you don't have to think about it. Right. And if you didn't, and particularly for one-on-ones, I find them incredibly frustrating and when I talk with direct reports, I really tell people that one-on-ones are for you, not for me. So it's for me to be able to, for you as the employee, to get access to the manager and try to figure out what the manager can give to you. It's not a place for the manager to tell you what to do. And so I implemented that, and a lot of my direct reports didn't put in the information that they needed to put in to actually get a meeting with me. So we didn't meet. And then they're also trained to be able to say, well, maybe we should actually discuss this earlier on. You can also set it in really intuitive ways where
I love this.
if it's less than 24 hours, if there's no comments less than 24 hours beforehand, it will delete the calendar invite. So we also seem to see this trend where everyone throws like all of their issues and tasks 1 hour before the meeting. No, none of that works.
Okay.
Like, that's for next week's meeting.
Yes.
Sorry.
Oh, I
like,
see.
you need to actually think about this mindfully. We don't want to just fill up a meeting with things to say. You actually, if it is truly important to you, then you shouldn't have waited an hour before the meeting to be able to put it in.
Got it. Liam, your daughter is 6, so really appreciate everything that you've shared. Oh, hello.
She's here in front of me.
And thank you very much for your time. I'm looking forward to more companies talking more about asynchronous work and how to optimize that, because I think it's definitely being empathetic, that's my thing, about people's time and energy and efforts, and channeling them in the right way.
Appreciate it. Stella, why don't you say bye-bye to everyone? Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Good job. Thank you very much.
Thanks again so much to Liam Martin, co-founder of Timedoctor and Staff.com. You can follow him on LinkedIn, on Twitter at Liam Martin, LiamMartin, or Instagram at Liam Remote. You can buy his book, Running Remote, and find out more about the Running Remote conference on YouTube. This year, the conference will be April 25th to 26th in Lisbon, Portugal. Other references and tools mentioned are in the show notes. Immediate action tip. Optimize for work rather than meetings. Use effective asynchronous enabling tools, including a project management system to be able to document information, and others to establish new processes that reduce live interactions. For more understanding about hybrid work models and integrating remote working successfully, there is an extensive, relevant section in Part 3 of my book, Empathy Works, the Key to Competitive Advantage in the New Era of Work. If you enjoy this podcast, please tell a friend, like it, and do write a quick review wherever you listen. For weekly video updates, follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter at @ASophieWade. For curated, useful articles, research, and information to help navigate this period of transformation, sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter on LinkedIn and my blog, which is available on sophiewade.com and flexcelnetwork.com. Until next time.